Welcome to our BABJ February meeting. Today we're going to talk about covering crime responsibly in Baltimore. Just to welcome you all, my name is Nikki Mayo. We have our monthly meetings on the fourth Saturdays of every month. And we try to do topics that help our members. We are the Baltimore Association of Black Journalists. So we try to help our members improve through professional development, as well as panels like this one, conversations, deep, thoughtful, scratching a lot deeper than you probably have in anybody's diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations. Just a warning for those of you guys who are new to us, welcome. How you doing, hon? And no, this is not DEI. This is not what we're doing today. We are really here to talk about how we can be better journalists, how we can talk about newsroom diversity all we want, but the reality is we need to talk about how are we telling these stories. And when it comes to crime in Baltimore, for those of us from here, it's almost like you grow up knowing how to spit out 1,400 block of this, 1,300 block of that. Blocks become just items, not locations. Death numbers become, or death tolls become numbers and less people. And that's not realistic. That's not right. That's not responsible journalism. And we're not here to sugarcoat that all we have to do is get more brown faces in the newsroom and make it better. There's a lot under the surface, and I'm hoping that today we'll be able to touch on that. So given that, I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, and then she'll have our panel do self-introductions to make sure we're not missing anything. My moderator today is the BABJ Secretary and Treasurer, Latoya Stevens. She's also executive producer over at WMAR-2 News. Still getting used to saying it. In my defense, it wasn't called that then. So, okay, but WMAR-2 News. And I love the fact that she'll be able to bring the perspective of she's newish to our market. So while I'm born here, so I have like a lot of, invested interest. And we have a panel of people who are all native Marylanders, and only one, I believe, is not from Baltimore. So that's pretty good considering I was really trying to get Black journalists that cover crime or are very connected to law enforcement. So that said, Latoya, I'm going to hand it over to you. And hopefully we'll have a conversation that's very open and thoughtful. For those of us that are not on the panel, I would love it if you could possibly engage first by throwing your questions and your comments in the chat, so that we don't speak over each other. And then if, I guess, as time arises and things make more sense, we might invite the voices in, but if you get muted, it's because we couldn't understand everybody. Make sense? All right. Take it away, Latoya.
Thank you, Nikki. So as she said, my name is Latoya. I'm an executive producer at WMAR. And when she says newish, I moved to Baltimore, Maryland in October of 2019. So just ahead of the pandemic, lucky me. But from my very first meeting at BABJ, this was a topic that I brought up because it is a very unique challenge. Having worked in other major markets like Miami and Atlanta, I'm used to dealing with major city crime, but there's a unique aspect to dealing with that and being sensitive and trying to be fair and balanced and managing the influx of information on a daily basis. And I just was looking for some direction, and so then we went into pandemic mode and things, and Nikki, definitely held us down and moved forward with us doing virtual panels. But when we talked about this year, I brought it back up again because, it's not going anywhere. This topic isn't going anywhere. So I'm really excited to hear from this panel. When she sent us, the list of the panelists, I was like, this is a great list. I follow you guys on Twitter. So I'm definitely, aware of your, influence and connection to the community. So I'm just going to introduce you by name and title, or as it relates to the panel, and then I'll let each individual give us a quick bio of themselves. So let's start with Lisa Snowden-McCray, excuse me. I just have you as Lisa Snowden on Twitter, which I'm obsessed with you on Twitter, by the way.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, so my name is Lisa Snowden. I am the managing editor over at The Real News. I also am the editor-in-chief of the Baltimore Beat. I'm definitely like kind of the most alternative reporter here on the panel, which doesn't mean, you know, there's lots of different ways to do journalism and we need all of them. I'm really happy to be here. I'm always happy to talk about issues that directly affect Black people. I'm so glad for Nikki's hard work and, you know, really everybody's work that's here in the panel. Really appreciative.
Thank you. And next we have BAL I-Team reporter Barry Sims.
Good morning. And I've been with WBAL for over 20 years. I have been doing investigative and mostly a lot of consumer reporting. I do a lot of that, but also I do the crime reporting as well for BAL. I grew up in Baltimore. I still live, I live in Pikesville, so I'm not too far from Baltimore right now. It's been a great and wonderful experience being here for the past 20 years, being back home, because I left for a while, but it has been great. I started in Rockford, Illinois. That was my first job. And then I went to Shreveport, Louisiana, then Dallas, Texas, then back to Shreveport, and then here to Baltimore. So that's me.
Okay, thanks so much. And then lastly, we have, last but not least, we have former public information officer for Baltimore City and Anne Arundel County and former mayoral candidate, TJ Smith. Welcome.
Hey, good morning, everybody, and thanks for having me. Great topic to discuss. I'm TJ Smith. I'm a native Baltimorean as well. I started out as a rank and file police officer in Anne Arundel County. I did a lot of work with the police and community unit in my younger days. Eventually got promoted up the ranks and started working in the chief's office. Became director of media relations there. Worked for, I think, 4 different chiefs there. Came to Baltimore PD as the chief of communications there and worked for, I think, 4 commissioners there. Was the press secretary for Johnny Oshesky in Baltimore County. There actually was part of the panel and the board, the lead board to select the police chief in Baltimore County. And I've been involved in law enforcement. I have my degrees aren't in law enforcement, but I've been involved in law enforcement for over 20 years total.
All right, thank you, TJ. So I'm just gonna start out with one question and kind of work through the panel in the reverse order. So the first person, if TJ could respond to this question first. It's a twofold question. And you have a unique, perspective because of how you relate to the media or have related to the media over the course of your career as opposed to being part of the media. But what do you believe that the number one thing is the media is doing wrong when it comes to covering crime in Baltimore? And what do you think is the number one thing that the media is doing right?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know the media executives hate the "if it bleeds, it leads," moniker, and they try to say that is not true, but that actually is true. One of the things that we want to showcase the good in the city of Baltimore, but if there's a violent crime that occurs, then the media is going to scurry to that if those two competing things happen at the same time. One of the things I think when we look at the bad is, and it was mentioned, I think either you or Nikki mentioned it early on, it's just really just counting the numbers. It becomes a normal thing. A 25-year-old Black man was killed in West Baltimore last night, and you move on. And we don't personalize the individuals. And one of the things I used to always talk about was, regardless of who the individual is, it could be a gangbanger, a violent repeat offender, that's the victim of that crime. At one point, and still to this day, somebody loves that person. And we need to understand that there's human life that's left. And many of these victims of crime have children, and their children aren't, the ones out there running around with guns and gangbanging. So this notion of just checking the box and just reading the name or reading the Black male that was killed in West Baltimore it makes us numb, I think, as a society. And that's just the volume of violence we have. From the good perspective, it's covered. I mean, it's talked about. And I think that's important, that it has to be talked about, because we also can't be numb to the fact that it's occurring. It's occurring, and we can't get angry. I'll tell you, when I was a mayoral candidate and I had a meeting with Sinclair, and one of the first questions I asked them was, I see you, Nikki, stop it.
No comment. Okay.
I'm sorry, I can't. No, I just cannot.
Okay.
I get it. But one of the first questions I asked them was, how do we remove the banner "City in Crisis"? I said, wake up every day and seeing that, and what that reinforces to people. So what are the parameters to move out of that? I get what we're dealing with, and the way it was explained to me, because we're going through the transition with a mayor who had just resigned, and scandals, and the BPD and everything else. Okay, yeah, arguably that is the definition of crisis. But I want to know what the parameters are to move out of it, because we should talk about it, but how do we exit out of it? So hopefully that answered it in a way around.
No, that was a very insightful answer. I just, my mind got sidetracked with that, envisioning the meeting with Sinclair, because I mean, there's a thought process behind choosing a brand. And so I don't know how they spun it in that meeting, but fundamentally you're making a decision on how you present everything when you choose that brand. But I digress.
Here's the reality of that.
And our people are watching them. That's my struggle. That's my struggle.
It influences people. So we have to have a seat at that table.
Yes.
And help craft what the messaging is going to be, because they are influencing people, whether we like the messaging.
Absolutely.
So
absolutely. Yeah. Well, I'm glad hopefully they continue to listen at least. Barry, you want to address the question?
Sure. One of the things that TJ said is we can't act like it's not happening. We can't act like crime is not happening. We can't act like other issues here in Baltimore City are not happening. And the one thing that we have to do, I think, is we have to look past, there's this murder, there's this issue, this whatever it is. How do we go past that and find out what's led to this? What is the issue that is behind all of this? One of the biggest things that I try to do is, because I know that everybody's watching to see what we do and what we say. So how do we present it? And I try real hard, and I know that there are other people on the panel too that try very hard to make sure that it is presented in a way that not only tells what happened, but also possibly, if we can, tell the story of the person that this criminal act has happened to, and get the family's perspective. And I think that gives us more of a way of really telling the story. And sometimes the information, I mean, you may just get from the police that this is all we know, and this is all it is. And if we just present it in just, this is what the police know, then we've got a problem sometimes, because it's just, we can't get past, we know that they're giving out information dealing with what the crime is and how they've investigated. But then there are so many other underlying factors that we really need to look into. And we really have to do, I think we're trying that, but I think we have to do it much harder to try to get there.
Thank you. Thank you. Lisa?
I'm saying it the question one more time.
Oh, what is Sure. What is the number one thing the media is doing wrong, and what is the number one thing you would say they were doing right as far as covering crime?
I think for the thing that they're doing wrong, I think that Barry and TJ have really great, thoughtful answers about how there's a lot of context and detail missing. But I also think that there needs to be way more people that look like you, Latoya, at the top. Mm-hmm. Like, reporters can be as sharp and smart and, driven as anything, but they're still got to take their stories and go through the editing process. And then their editors have bosses that they answer to. So there needs to be people that have that agency to be able to be like, no, like this is racist, this is bad, this shouldn't be the way that it is. So, and like the thing that like a lot of white bosses have said is, oh, we're trying for, and this has been, before a lot of us were even born, they've been giving this line about we're trying. we're still here. Like Ida B. Wells was doing the work, like our grandparents were doing the work. And it's getting to the point where it's unacceptable for y'all to say, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, but like that you can't find Black people to be in these executive level roles to really help be the thoughtful voices to say like, this is why this thing is bad. So I think that's kind of the bad thing. I think the good thing is the fact that like the people that are, you know, people like Tremont, people like you, Latoya, people like Barry, people like Phillip, who's an amazing journalist. They're allowing them to be amazing. Like let people do their job, hire Black and brown voices, and we won't have some of these problems.
Okay, so this is actually the answers to the questions are now. I love it being organic because it kind of is taking me off the order of the questions that I had. So this is a controversial one that I would love to get your input on, as far as the context and when it's worthy and valid and when it's not. Mugshots and surveillance pictures. Lisa's face just said it all. So here's the thing. I don't have a rule of never, ever, ever, you know, but I have, my team is aware that you don't use one without talking to me and what is the context. I do have a rule about no mugshots of victims, which my experience has been, so you have inexperienced journalism, you have lazy journalism, you know, and just, you know, not non-questioning journalism. So if the police sent the picture of the victim and it's a mugshot, well, the police sent it to us, you know, like that's a lot of what happens when it happens. But perception is reality. So, you know, an outlet, whether it be a newspaper or a television station, could have that internal policy of like having a discussion when we use it. But if you do it once a week, then you get the emails of that's all y'all show. And, you know, like, so, you know, I do think that there's a concerted effort in a lot of newsrooms to get away from that. Definitely, I know for sure in my career, the super vague descriptions of, you know, Black man, 5'11", wearing a black jacket, that is not acceptable anymore. But again, I had a diversity meeting one time where there was a coworker who was like, but it still happens. I'm not saying that, you know, someone right out of school who got that police description didn't put it up on the web before like a boss saw it. It happens, but it's not acceptable anymore. But what do you think about the use of mugshots and trying to give that context? Like for just this week, there was some surveillance pictures, and in the script I added that my producer wrote, I was like, we are showing you these pictures because there's a public safety concern, not just because, you know, and that's kind of how I try to make those decisions. Lisa, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, I mean, like the context that you just noted is important. Like, yes, if there was somebody outside literally right now in White Marsh where I am, and they're like stabbing people, I want to know what they look like. But, right. But if we're just using this to generate clicks,
right,
then it's not doing anything. The thing that I say a lot of times on Twitter when I get mad is like, if you want to go work for the police, you can do that and you will probably make more money. Like TJ had a specific job when he was working for police. Police PIOs, that's their job. That's their lane to like take that picture, process that picture and do, you know, what they need to do with it. That doesn't necessarily always intersect with what our job is though. So like if we're working for police, then we need to stop back and be like, wait a minute. Like, first of all, we don't even get those kind of benefits. So let's not like go overboard, but like, let's make sure that these are things that actually do help the people that we're trying to serve. So like, right. It's just that extra level of thoughtfulness that I think is so important.
Definitely that effort. Like, I mean, just simply reaching back out to police or asking for, you know, could they ask the family for another picture? You know, I've had to take the call of a mother whose daughter was missing, and she was just devastated because they used a mugshot as the picture, you know, and again, that wasn't on my watch, but I got it rectified. But, you know, how heartbreaking is it for them? And that does cost us trust from the community. Barry, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, one of the things that I know that we are doing now is we have a discussion before any mugshots are even placed. So if I'm doing a crime story, if I'm doing a murder or anything like that, the question is, and I've got to get with our leadership team. is this necessary? Do we need to put this mugshot out? If it is, and basically we've got criteria and basing it on the seriousness of the crime. If there is a reason to put it out in terms of this person is still being sought by police or something like that. So, I mean, we're at least looking at those things. I try real hard too, and the thing is, I think one of the things that we have to look at is we've got to ask the question too, as has been stated. We've got to say, look, is there, before we make a decision as to putting the things out, what's going to be the best way of doing this? Why are we doing this? What is going to be the impact of doing this? So all those things have to be focused on, and that means that we have to work harder in terms of trying to make sure that because my biggest concern, especially in a crime story, is the family is already devastated, and then you do something that harms them even more or upsets them even more, and it wasn't necessary. And if you just took a little time to just think, then that can make the biggest difference in the world. So I think we just have to keep focusing on that.
Thanks, Barry. TJ?
All right, thank you. I'm amongst family, so I might use a bad word or two here because...
Just a warning, I don't really know some of these people, so I don't know how much family really is here.
All right.
Okay.
I got a lot of crap from some people over the years, and I worked hard to ensure a level of equity in ways, because when it comes to like a missing person, for instance, that was just brought up, a homicide info sought, that didn't necessarily come through any of my PIO shops. It was done in those shops, and then I would see it. And if the walls could talk in my offices, they would have a lot of bad words being said about why are we putting a mugshot on a victim out in the community? Because he looks like a bad guy. That's ridiculous. If y'all want to look and look at my history, go to hashtag BPD case files, a show that we started for victims that aired on WBAL radio, and look at all the posters that we had there. And my entire point was I want smiling family interacting, that human being, so it can tug on people's heartstrings so they can see somebody love this individual that's dead. And that's important. And one of the other things that is important, and look, for my media people, y'all can't have it both ways, because when the police department doesn't send out the mugshot, then y'all tweeting about the police department not being transparent. So you have to take it and then make the decision on your own. Because one of the other things that I implemented in Baltimore City and in Anne Arundel County, along with the filters that I had to have on Facebook because of the different racist remarks, was a specific standard of what mugshot was going to be posted on social media. Murder, rape, wanted, or info sought, missing person. Robberies, we didn't put them out because it would be plastered with black faces all day long, and we would deal with the comments from people that just said something, especially during Obama years. That's Barry's son. How many times I had to erase those messages? So it's a responsibility, obviously, from even people on my side of that industry to not feed into a potential stereotype, and even going to videos of violent crimes. If a blur just ran across the screen, we're not putting that out. And then the victim said that it was a black person. No. It's no value in it. And again, this is the information where, one, you can look and say, why they have to put that mugshot out? But then you go to the social media channels of the agency and you don't see it anywhere. The reason the media got it is because of the Public Information Act. And it is incumbent upon a journalist to try to reach out to family. And I think any journalist I've worked with can attest that I'll give you some off the record information to help lead you in a direction of getting the appropriate information. And I think it's incumbent upon a journalist to try to get that family picture or the person in their element, as I would like to say. So it wasn't always a mugshot. And you also have to be careful with MVA photos, because they also have that deadpan look where it could come across where it feels like it's a mugshot as opposed to a smiling face. because we're trying to show you this person was a victim, not this person with the middle fingers up, gold teeth out, like, and I got a gun in my dip. It doesn't send the right image.
Yeah, thank you very much, CJ. I appreciate that. And the irony is that not irony, but a lot of PIOs used to work in news. So I do get that it's not always directly coming from your departments and your peers. So we have a couple of questions from the group. Maria has a great question related to this. It's, if you are in a newsroom where those conversations are not happening, how can a reporter or staffer start those conversations? So I'm gonna send this one directly to Barry. What do you think about?
You got to just start the conversation. I mean, if you see something, or if things have been happening in that newsroom and you are disturbed by it and you don't like the way that those images, and you have to say something. And if you need more help, then you've got the local chapter here, you've got the national chapter, you've got other journalism associations. The thing is, make them understand that this is wrong. I mean, if you have to, I mean, if we need to come over and talk, then I'll come over and talk. I mean, the problem is that there's so many negative images and things that are out there all the time. And so it's just, how do I make sure that I'm not adding to that problem? And if you feel like there's things like that are happening in where you're working, then we need to and you need some help, then we'll help you. That's what we'll do.
Yeah, and to echo what Barry said, I think that, the people in the newsroom, most of the time it might be someone who is is in the community as well, but like someone who has more experience, because I have found that most of the time, if there's something that's disturbing someone and they don't speak up, it's a younger journalist who's not afraid of rocking the boat. And I try to empower, everyone from my assignment editor to my AP, we are all the gatekeepers. And I mean, sometimes we're just making a sausage. It's not that, things are intentionally being ignored, but speak up and empowering someone, like you said, to know that they have an ally, that they're not going to go out there, say something, and everyone's going to be, it's going to be crickets and no one has their back. So I think, just, finding an ally, whether it's someone of color or not, that, understands the concern and is willing to back your play.
And Lisa, just one other quick thing on you. And I know you can be afraid of or scared and worried about, well, what's going to happen if I speak up? But if you don't speak up, then you still have that thing gnawing at you. So you got to speak up.
Yeah. Lisa, you want to weigh in?
I mean, I'm kind of the odd person out here in that I have my own outlet, and also I work at a very lefty organization. So it's a little bit different. I mean, definitely progressive white does not mean you're not racist, but I have kind of built a following and have a track record that means that my voice gets heard a little bit more. The thing that I'm curious, actually, I was looking to see if Phillip wanted to talk, because I know that at the Sun, there is kind of that, it seems like, at least from the outside, there's that kind of tight-knit community within the Sun of Black journalists. I know that, what's his name, that does the food reporting?
John.
Yeah, John doesn't play. And John now is in charge of some of the diversity reporting. So I think that there's always strength in numbers. So whether it be, I was gonna say what Barry said, organizations like this are so important, and figuring out other folks inside the newsroom that can have your back when people do start acting crazy. I think that's important too.
Thank you. Yeah, let's hear from Phillip. I was just messaging Nikki to make sure he was good to go. Phillip, you want to jump in?
Yeah, can you all hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. But yeah, I mean, I guess for the part Lisa was mentioning about the close-knit environment for journalists, I mean, yeah, John is one. Daniel Oyefusi, who covers sports as well. He does a lot of, I think if you all follow him, he does a lot of tweets daily on University of Maryland Terrapins for basketball, football, for the Ravens, but he also talks a little bit as well about kind of just newsroom culture to an extent and somewhat. But I think one of the common trends that we find in not, and everything is not just Baltimore exclusive to as well, but like when things are when you're in a city who's covering a predominantly Black city like Baltimore or Philadelphia or Memphis or other areas like that, a lot of these areas, they look at the newsrooms and they see who comes in their communities on a frequent basis. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of Black journalists in newsrooms realize. They may either bring it up to their editors, or they may just have those conversations amongst themselves. And that, a lot of times that does make the job harder, because you kind of feel like you have this mission and you're trying to fix the issues of this community and you're trying to write these types of stories. And, one thing that I kind of took upon myself really, that I really haven't seen too many newsrooms do as much, is just kind of really try to focus in on the lives of homicide victims close to a nearly like daily basis. Baltimore has 300 plus for the last 6 years. And when we were talking about the mugshots, a lot of the victims who I wrote about, they did have like some smaller, lower level offenses. And there is like this notion of like, whether it's like an officer involved shooting or a homicide, like there's going to be like this perfect victim, man, that, like kind of, it makes me kind of think about like the Trayvon Martin situation. And they talked about like marijuana being in his system in the autopsy after the fact. It's an interesting part to me when we even look at the homicide crime coverage. Like there's this reputation that's put amid Baltimore homicide victims, even like younger victims and males and women, that they were already involved in a certain type of lifestyle. And it kind of like ultimately led to their killing, when we all know that a lot of these issues are rooted a lot more deeply in the city. Like a lot of these people, they're living in failing infrastructure and things like that, and those are kind of obvious things that I don't think you can really ignore.
Thanks so much. Glad you're with us, Phillip. I had another question from the group. Hold on, I want to go back up. So from Lionel Smith, there isn't enough justice reporting since there's not enough follow-up on what happens in court and what leads to so many crimes going unsolved, I believe is what he was asking. So we can, again, since we have you up right now, Phillip, you want to weigh in on that? Because I know you just mentioned the 300 homicides. Like, when you have limited resources, it's really hard. So what do you think about that question? Just the follow-up on the crimes after the initial breaking news situations.
Right, yeah. So that's the follow-ups after that, I think, there's usually a lot to explore. Sometimes it depends on, like, I have sources, for example, where I might get like a tip on something, like a detail, like a victim's name, age, or like a possible motive or something like that. But I can't necessarily just like put that out there without doing some type of verifying with the PIO on the job, who's like disseminating the information out to the TV stations, us, and everybody else. Even though I can confidently feel as a reporter, like I know this is right, I know this is the type of case, like whether it's maybe like an accidental killing, or if it's like a street robbery turned homicide type of situation. You just have to kind of go the extra mile to verify it. And then I think, if you're somebody who puts your information out a lot on social media, if you're, I think you can confidently put that out with BPD sources, but just also make sure you establish a relationship with those sources that you develop, to where you're not putting them in a bad position as well with the police department, to where they're not getting those calls from whoever's in the office, because you kind of want to keep that person still feeding you that type of information, to kind of stay ahead of the game pretty much. But yeah, I would still say, when it comes to the follows after that, a lot of the homicide victims in Baltimore, they have lives, and they have interesting backgrounds and stories about them. And I think the more you talk with these families and kind of see how they're living on a daily basis, I think that makes it more important to tell the full scope of the story in the city.
Thanks. Barry, you want to weigh in? I actually misread part of what Lana's question. Now I understand. And this is even more challenging in the age of COVID because, you know, we are not in court like that, but it says what happens in court can lead to some crimes going unsolved. And whether that means, you know, ADA's decision or witness not showing up, I'm not, you know, and before you maybe had someone who was on that beat, but now those relationships that Phillip referred to are critical so that a family member can tell you what happened because you can't go. Barry?
Yeah, I'm trying to deal with the justice part of that. I know that we do try to follow up through, especially if someone's been arrested, and we try to follow the cases through court. And of course, with COVID, it's been nearly impossible to try to do that. So that's one of the issues. Unless the case goes before a judge or something like that. But I think that one of the other issues is when you're going through the cases, even before COVID, I remember going through several cases, and it looked like there was a person who had been charged with the case, dealing with, let's say, a homicide, charged with a homicide, had been gone through the whole system and the court system, and then either something happened with the case and it got dropped, or there was a jury that found the person not guilty. And then the question is, okay, so who was the person that was involved in this and who did this? And the problem there is, where does the case go at that point? And I can see the point of things just being dropped at that point, because there is no, is there any follow-up at that point? So what happens to trying to solve this at this point? Is there another investigation? Are we looking for other suspects or anything like that? So that, I know that those types of things have happened. The question is, how do we do better in terms of getting the investigation started again to find out what happened or what may have been left out that could have helped to really solve this case.
TJ, you want to weigh in? I mean, what we're saying, you know, the desire is there. Do you have any ideas or suggestions?
I mean, it's tenacity on the reporter's part, quite honestly, and this is a resource thing. I know that newsrooms are spread thin across the country, and certainly here in Baltimore as well. But again, living in a city like Baltimore, so much happens on a daily and weekly basis that you move on from outrage so quickly that that's last week's news. I mean, Dante Barksdale was killed in Baltimore in January. We've moved on. We're way past that. And I haven't heard of a suspect being arrested in that case. And you think a person on a quote peace mission in the city of Baltimore, a violence interrupter being killed, that's a big deal. We've moved on, because it wasn't a week or so or 2 weeks later that a bus driver was killed in the middle of the afternoon, and in one of the more egregious murders ever. So I think it's a combination of things where it's a resource issue, but at the same time, I think as long as you continuously pitch it, and I had some success with that with BPD case files, where every murder that we did on that show was normally a quote cold case that was older. And I would pitch it to different reporters, and every now and again it would get picked up and be back on the news again to follow up on. But unfortunately, again, if it bleeds, it leads. And if it's a high profile murder, that's the ones that seem to get the most follow up. When, you know, I was big, again, as a mayoral candidate on geography. You know, that's a story that's not told. I mean, you put Vine Street and Lexington Street in the last 5 years and how many murders just took place in that geography. The trauma that exists in just that community alone is a story to be told. And I think it just have to be tenacious about it. But this is really not on anybody on this call. This is on the people that are sitting in the offices and sitting in nice homes right now on acreage that are making the calls of what's going to be on television or what's going to be in the newspaper. Print has a seems like a better opportunity to follow up and tell those stories of the individuals. But television is difficult because it's not, news,
Right. Definitely. That's kind of the last thing you said kind of addresses one of the other questions that's a tangent to this, which is who has the responsibility to follow those kinds of stories? Is it left to the reporters, or are newsroom managers the ones who should prioritize that? So I'm just going to direct that question directly to Lisa. I mean, TJ just kind of touched on that.
Yeah, I mean, TJ said a lot of what I was going to say, which is that like we are all spread so thin. Like I am both trying to be a content creator and also managing a newsroom. My boss, who's the editor-in-chief over at The Real News, is trying to manage, board of directors and fundraising and content creating and managing a newsroom. At The Sun, it's like long as, again, preaching to the choir, but like in-depth, feature-y type of reporting, deep dive reporting is expensive because you have to be able to take the time and take your brain away from the day-to-day stuff and really deep dive into that stories. And we don't have those kind of resources anymore. So really again, I'm shockingly agreeing way more than I thought I was going to agree with you, TJ. Look
at us. Yeah.
But it's the imperative on the people that are in charge to really we can't fund the way that we used to fund. We can't sit back and think that like advertisers are going to just be able to fund this stuff. It's now we're all kind of waiting to see what's going to happen with The Sun and this the fact that it's going to be a nonprofit, because it's imperative for like basically everybody now to start thinking of new ways to be able to feed ourselves. It should not be a situation where somebody like Phillip has to be worried about paying his rent while doing his very important job. Like there needs to be ways that we figure out funding where people can live and also tell these super important stories. I never thought that I was going to be like in charge. I never thought that I would have to know all the things about fundraising that I now have to know. I thought I was going to write stories for the rest of my life, but now I have to know how to pitch funders and write a grant and all this other kind of stuff, because it's either that or I starve.
That's a very important point. And it's, since you mentioned print and their approach, and their obviously we're doing like 30-minute newscasts, hour-long newscasts. It's a different beast. But the short-term versus long-term like investment in doing those follows. One of the things that you kind of touched on, like TJ mentioned Barksdale, and I was thinking that when someone else was sharing about that case, and how like what a poignant example to me that also touches on like how does a reporter, you guys are all from Maryland. I think Nikki said only one of you isn't from like the Baltimore area, but how does a journalist who's new to the area start building the trust to get those connections in the community? Because it's also kind of like that anti-snitch culture, right? And so like, you have someone who wants to do those like human peace stories and talk about like the victim and give perspective. But if they don't know you, if they haven't seen you on the news for the last 20 years, they're less inclined to talk to you. So do you have any suggestions on building those relationships sooner than later? Like I have a reporter who's been here 4 years. He's finally getting some, making some headway. Phillip, I know you are from here, but you like took the long way around, having left and come back. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, actually, I had a somewhat interesting experience first coming here. I think my first week, I think I was about 3 days in on the job, 3 or 4 days in, but it was this, she's a local resident, somewhat you could say community activist. Her name is Cindy Tinsley. She lived in Carrollton Ridge, and she actually gave me, I set up like a long day community tour. Like Carrollton Ridge was a neighborhood that had a lot of drug issues, low poverty, housing issues, crime, homicides, as you can, kind of everything at once, pretty much. So she set up a community tour with me. I met with a few on the ground grassroots organizations, some local groups in the city. I know they had a food group that a lot of young kids work with. They come in to do cooking cooking, culinary arts, certain things like that, just to do other things when they can't, like, I guess, do sports with their friends, just have other ways to get involved in life outside of school, after school, while they're living at home with parents, or, however their home structure is. But I think, if anything, that's kind of the key to developing, it seems like, that sense of trust in the community that you're really kind of speaking towards, is that you really just have to put yourself there and, like, consistently, really, like, you can't just parachute in when it's about, like, a 3 hour homicide within, like, an hour or something like that. You kind of have to go into the area, be visible, talk to some of the community leaders who are on the ground there, find out who the council person is, and find out who these groups are that work with these kids on a daily basis, and see, like, their daily lives outside of the violence that only really makes the news. Like, we don't really get the daily issues of people's living circumstances before, a certain type of story happens. And I think when you put yourself there as a reporter to meet with these people, and, a lot of these community leaders who are actually willing and excited to talk to reporters, because they're really not used to seeing us there in their neighborhoods on a consistent basis. I think that's what makes a lot of the reporting a lot more richer going forward.
Good answer. Thank you. Thank you. So Nikki gave me a tangent to this. I'm going to pose this to TJ, maybe. She said, what if you're scared of the community you cover?
Well, that actually is a question that can transition into policing and journalism and other professions, for that matter. You shouldn't work there. Because you're gonna be biased or prejudiced or something, because you already have some thoughts. That's why you have some fears. So you're gonna have to get over it. But if you can't handle it, you can't do it. You can't do it effectively. I think what Phillip just said was just spot on. It couldn't have been said any better. Get to know those people. And as journalists, you're trying to write a colorful story, and to inject a few of those points that he knows about the food project down there in Southwest Baltimore, Carrollton Ridge. And he wouldn't have known those details had he not engaged himself with the community leader there. So when that violence happens, he already can color it with all of these things that are affecting the community on a socioeconomic level. And if you're not willing to get that down and dirty, and that goes for the industry that I worked in for a large portion of my life, if you're not willing to understand where some of this is coming from, then you don't need to be there, because you're going to treat people the wrong way.
Definitely. Barry?
Can I add just one other thing? And this
absolutely.
With what Phillip is talking about, and also TJ. The other part of that is, as you develop your stories, and as you report them, and people see the way that you reported them, that also helps build. Because what happens is they see, okay, this is somebody that really does have a perspective of what we're talking about, or at least is listening to our perspective. And it also says, they kind of care about the community. And the thing is, if people feel like you're caring, then they're much more open to talking to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that point, the reporter I was referring to, he's a person of color, but he's not Black. And he has done a lot of those stories, a lot of those features. The farmer who just started, the Black farmer who just started the brick and mortar store last year. And one of the things that I am proud of with our station, more so than any station that I've worked at in any other market, is the weight we give to those stories. So it's not go shoot the feel-good story for a 30-second both side. It's a 2-minute package, and that matters. Like, the weight that you give it matters. So I think that, there's no surprise that he's the one that, despite the fact that he's not, a Black man, he's building those relationships because they see what he's doing in the community. Lisa, you want to weigh in?
I think the only thing I want to add is, like, it really is annoying that, like, because journalism is so white, like, people have long memories. So, like, I would go out, be covering stuff for City Paper, which is also, like, a very white institution. Like, I think I was the first full-time Black City Paper reporter. People would be like, oh, I remember this, reporter came to my house, showed up at my door, said my name wrong, got the story all wrong. ran this, and like, so it's like annoying as a person that cares to have to go back and fix the wrongs that were done by people thoughtlessly before you. But also, I guess the good part of that is like when you treat people with care and respect, you know, it's the opposite. I think people remember that too. Like I wrote a story again for City Paper about a lady whose brother was murdered, and she had a really bad experience with the son, but like was so grateful that we were able to tell her brother's story with like dignity. I'm actually not from Baltimore. I'm from Annapolis. Like all my cousins are from here, but I'm from Annapolis. But even if I was covering stories in Annapolis, the thing that I try to remember is like people do not owe me their story, even if it's a thing where like I could, if I had to, I would have to just use the basic information from whatever. So like if I'm going in somebody's house, I need to respect their house. I need to respect their culture, and they're giving me their time, and I need to treat whoever it is, whether it be the mayor or somebody that's houseless on the street. I need to treat both of them with the same measure of respect and decency.
And Latoya, I wanted to just add real quick. One of the things, me having worked more as a connector as well, people have you guys that are in TV journalism, especially, have to understand that the regular lay citizen doesn't understand television, so they don't realize that this 1 hour interview that you did with them is going to be a minute and 15 on TV. Right. I think being honest with them that you want to hit the high notes, and you're not going to be able to get this much in is something that needs to come across. But I'm gonna put Barry on the spot. He's gonna hate me for it, but I'll put myself on the spot as well with that. But when the riots were going on in 2015 and Barry was standing over on Hilton Parkway or the different communities he was in, Barry shed a tear on regular television in a moment because it was real. It was real to him, and it was real to the community, and people that impacted people differently because they knew he cared. This wasn't NBC or CBS national reporter coming in and reporting on the latest crisis and they're going off to the next city. This is home. This is where he has lived and where he currently lives. And he knows these streets intimately. So what it invoked in us was different. And obviously, most people know my personal story. My brother was killed in these streets. So as I'm reporting daily on this violence that is happening in our city, and then next thing you know, boom, it impacts me directly. Those moments of vulnerability from those of us who are public figures and reporting and what have you are also important to build a level of trust, because I think people will know that you're going to handle their situation delicately.
Barry, you want to chime in?
As soon as I can get, there we go. I couldn't get the mute off. Sorry about that. Yeah. So that is still a very poignant moment, I guess, for me. And even now, I still feel it. And to give you everybody some perspective, and I'll do it real briefly. That was my neighborhood. That's where I grew up. And there was a store that had been a pharmacy and then a grocery store, and then a liquor store. And it had been there all of my life. And it was owned by an Asian couple at that time. And at the same time, there were other stores that were being burned down in certain communities. The store being burned down was one issue, but the other issue was there were people who lived next door. There was a woman who had a son who basically could not get around without his wheelchair. They had to escape that fire. They barely made it. So that was another issue. Fortunately, they made it. The wheelchair didn't. So as I'm putting on the story, I'm talking about trying to get help to get this wheelchair for this kid. And you can't imagine how many people actually came by and dropped off wheelchairs, because that's how you find how people are really caring and want to help. They also came and tried to give me money, which I could not take, which was very interesting, trying to get them to understand. Like one guy came up and tried to hand me $100. And I'm like, I cannot take this money. we're going to try to figure out how to set this up so that you can do this. But also, this being my neighborhood, in 1968, when Dr. King was murdered, that same street was a street where the National Guard came. And so I remember running out of my house one day, looking down right down at the bottom of the steps, and there was a Jeep with National Guardsmen, and everybody had guns. So what was I, six, I think, 6 years old? And this is the scene I see. And that scene, and as somebody told me before, trauma kind of stays with you if you don't deal with it. I didn't think that it was a problem until that moment that that store burned, and I'm standing there and I get asked about my neighborhood. And then it all just flooded out. And that's what happened in that moment. But the thing was, it was still a situation where there were still great people who were still trying to come and help out as much as they could.
Yeah. You just wow, you said a lot, gave me a lot to process, but it's interesting the last thing you ended on, because in our previous meeting when we were discussing the topics, I was telling the group that one of my former coworkers, Skylar Henry, when he was here, I worked with him in a previous market, and he was taking me around when I came for the interview. And one of the things that he said about Baltimore, when he was like, been here 2 years at that point, 2 or 3 years. And he was like, Baltimore is a beautiful city. It's got a great heart, and it's got a lot of trauma. And it's just, when you brought up the National Guard, I was thinking last year, I don't know if you guys remember that day that I think they were here for some COVID rollout. It had nothing to do with protest or something. And when I say the newsroom phones were blowing up, I think it was PTSD. It was people flashing back to the last time they were here. And it was just like a drill or whatever it wasn't what they thought. But when they saw those tanks, the response just definitely was revealing about the trauma. So can you guys talk about that balance of acknowledging it, trying to be, arbiters of healing it and doing your job? We're on you, Barry. We'll let you.
Oh, okay, I'll go.
Yeah, okay.
I thought you would give somebody else a chance.
Well,
it is difficult. TJ talked about his brother being killed. So I covered that as a story, and also the court case. So it is very difficult to deal with. And a lot of times, because of growing up here, you find that you end up doing stories on people or families that you may know. Or there's some connection that they may I've done stories where people go, oh, your mother taught me in school, and all of those things. And the thing is, now, how do I help this person understand what I'm trying to do in terms of talking with them and getting them to just express what happened? I try really hard, and it's real difficult too, to try to talk to people and get them to understand, look, I'm not trying to exploit you. I'm trying to just get everyone to understand exactly what happened and how this is impacting you. And some families and some people are very good at saying, okay, well, we can do that. Others, they just can't. And so that's the other part. You got to know when to walk away and say, this person just can't handle this right now, and I can't be a burden to them. The other thing and I'm going to say this too, because it drives me crazy, is there are times, especially when people have been through trauma, where we're not caring enough to make sure that they are cared for and that they're caring for themselves. I've seen, and what I've done is, look, I want to talk to you, but right now, you've got curlers in your hair, you are dressed in your robe, and I can't talk to you that way. I'm not going to put you on like that. Yeah. I will give you, if you're still willing to talk to me, I'll give you time so that you can get yourself together. And how grateful they are, because you've given them a few minutes. And I can tell you, there was one time I got really, really pissed off. And this wasn't a crime. Well, it was a crime story, but it was somebody who had been, someone had broken into their home. And someone from our station actually did go in and interview the person. And when I saw the story in the air, I was livid. And I just had to, we can't do that kind of stuff. I had to say, look, couldn't you have given them a couple of minutes? Couldn't you have said, hey, you know, it's not that we're in that much of a rush, but the thing is, all of that matters. It matters because it makes them feel, okay, despite the issues that I'm going through, I don't have to feel like, oh man, I look like a total fool. And I don't want to make anybody look like a fool, except in the consumer stories when they deserve it. Other than that, I mean, we cover too many different things. I just don't want people to feel like we have exploited them. I want to tell your story. I don't want to exploit you. And I always ask at the end, do you feel like there's anything that has been said that you kind of regret? And do we need to rediscuss something or anything like that? Just to give them that opportunity, especially with a family that's dealing with that kind of pain. Because I don't want them to feel like I've added to that pain. Mm-hmm. And I want them to feel like, you know, he tried to tell my story. And even if they don't agree with the way that I told the story, if they call me back and say, you know, I wish you had said this instead of that. For the most part, I get that, you know, but I'm glad you told the story. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, that was a whole word, Barry. I definitely related to a lot of what you said. Lisa, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about a piece that was probably the one that really drained me in a lot of ways. So like there was trauma from the subjects, and then it was just a difficult piece for me. So I wrote about sexual assault allegations against an activist group here in Baltimore. The first time that I spoke to this young woman, it was when she first was even accepting the fact that she had been assaulted. That's, as a person who's also been through assaults, that's a process. And then I pitched this to the Afro, and my editor was like, okay, it sounds like a story. And then I never heard from this girl for a very long time. And my editor was like, what happened with that? And I was like, I never heard from her. I'm not pressing her. And then she came back. And so we worked on the story, but even like through the whole story, it kind of goes back to what TJ was saying about how people don't really understand reporting, because like there was several layers of reporting that I had to go through to make sure that we didn't want to throw some people under the, we wanted to do our due diligence as journalists. And so but she and some women that were representing her were just like, what? Like, why do we have to keep telling the story? It's like re-traumatizing over and over. And I'm like, yeah, but like, that's kind of how it goes, unfortunately. So I think that was the hardest. And it really made me realize how much people on the outside don't understand how journalism works. Mm-hmm. But also that journalism as an institution that was not created for anybody in any marginalized group, like it's not built for caring about people. So like you do, like we're so lucky to have people like Barry that can kind of take those extra steps. It's also why I feel so comfortable saying all the things that I say publicly, because I'm like, the system, the way that it is supposed to be me just shutting up and just doing one thing, but it's like that doesn't serve so many people. So I don't know. I feel like I'm kind of all over the place right now, but like that was really like, I think something that was really hard. And I think the thing that I learned was like having to give people space, because I wasn't going to go tracing after this girl. I was like, please. And actually, as it turned out, it does seem like she kind of went through all of that for nothing, because nothing really came of it. Mm-hmm. But having to walk somebody through that process was just a crazy, emotional, impactful situation. I also just want to say, like, just going off of what Barry just said, like, the thing that really strikes me is how important it is to have people that have those years of experience. Like, I'm just sitting here thinking about how many people get shoved out of journalism in general because, the money's not there. So everybody's suffering. And of course, whenever everybody suffers, Black people suffer the most. So there's like just not the people that have that depth of experience that look like us anymore. And it's just like, I think that story that you told, Barry, like that really, even though I don't work in TV, like that just really affected me. And I'm just really glad that you're still working in journalism and telling Black people's stories in Baltimore.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. The one thing that as we're going through, we're talking about crime, but I mean, just looking at the pandemic stuff, that's crazy too. And dealing with people, I've been dealing with a lot of unemployment stories and stuff like that. It's just the trauma that people are going through with that is just amazing too. But I'm going to stop.
No, I'm gonna open it up to Phillip and TJ as well. But just quickly, what you guys both touched on too, that I think 2020 started more of a conversation about us dealing with our own trauma in covering these stories, you know, like more so that was a discussion in J groups everywhere, you know, just us helping each other, because you're like in it for 8-12 hours a day, and then you got to come home and process, you know, your feelings. So it's not just, you know, it's helping someone with their trauma, and it's owning yours and dealing with yours as well. Phillip, you want to weigh in?
Yes. Yeah, I think, you know, like this past year, 2020, for one, was definitely an interesting part for Baltimore when it comes to the, I guess, balancing trauma and within some of the stories that were happening in the city this year between, like, contrasting police brutality protests happening in the city on a daily basis and the very, very, very large turnout that was happening. And then also having to run into a homicide scene right after that amid the protests. So, I mean, there was one story that happened on Juneteenth, actually. You know, I was assigned to cover kind of like either celebrations, demonstrations, rallies, protests happening for, you know, celebration of Juneteenth for obvious reasons. And then that same day, there was an overnight incident to where a pregnant woman and her daughter were killed, and they were actually left in the car for, like, I think at least close to 12 hours. Her name was Cheyenne Miller, and her daughter Shania Gilmore. So, you know, like that story was, I think, if I had to say, one of the more interesting or like somewhat traumatic profiles, I think it was probably that one, just because of the nature of the incident, for one, you know. But then when you get to the actual scene and like community members are coming out, that this woman and her daughter were sitting in the car for overnight for about 12 hours, and nobody knew, nobody said anything. Nobody really knew much information about what happened at that immediate time until a lady walked out of her house and drove by and saw both of their bodies, you know, sitting in the car overnight. So, you know, like that, I think when you have certain things like that, and then, you know, you're a local reporter and you're kind of like looking at some of the national coverage, and you are kind of to an extent wondering why, you know, like these specific incidences, when you know what they root and stem from in Baltimore, aren't, you know, getting that type of national attention. And, you know, it is, no, that's a level of like, I think, traumatic things that reporters go through, because you want to make sure like that type of story gets out there and it's getting told, because, you know, it's deeper than just the death that's happening. It's like what led to that, circumstances that led to that, where it happened and why it happened, you know. And I think that's another like burden that a lot of reporters carry, is that when we see these stories, I think that Barry mentioned, and probably TJ can relate, and Lisa as well, you know, like when we see these stories, you know, we really kind of want to go all out and make sure that people know what's going on and why it's happening. You know, like, just because, you know, like it's almost like Baltimore, people have this perspective of Baltimore where like something is expected almost, as opposed to, you know, dealing with the issue head on and kind of addressing those problems that have been lingering for so long before, like, you know, Brandon Scott got into his mayor position and so on and so forth.
Thanks, Phillip. I'm gonna hand it over to TJ. I want to hear from you, and then I think we'll like open it up for other comments or questions.
You know, I'll briefly say, you know, the trauma is real, and I don't know if we understand how real the trauma is with people and the responsibility we all hold because we're delivering that news that's going to traumatize a family. I've had the occasion to do it from multiple facets, whether it be in my law enforcement career of knocking on that person's door to tell them that their loved one's not coming home, to deliver it to the community as a spokesperson, to do the radio show and deliver the news to people. But I think what you have to realize and recognize is that the individuals who were directly affected by that trauma will never forget you for that trauma, for that experience. You stand out to them. And you can't look at people like objects. You know, when the week my brother was killed, I was supposed to have been going on a vacation, and the phone calls, the local media primarily had a great deal of respect and privacy. But I got some phone calls like, hey, can you do an interview on this? And I'm like, no, you do know that was like my brother. Like, this is real. And it was offensive. And being able to, unfortunately, experience it in that way, it gives you a different perspective of what you're about to ask someone to do, that vulnerable state. But it also gave me a perspective, and I can remember this from my days again in law enforcement. I remember I had to knock on a person's door to tell her that her husband was killed. And I saw her a couple of years later, and I couldn't remember who she was. And she stopped. She said, hey, TJ. I said, hey, how you doing? She said, you don't remember me, do you? I said, I can't place you. She said, you told me my husband was dead. I said, wow. I said, how are the kids doing? Yeah, they're not doing well. I'm like, okay, this is really awkward. But we were able to reconcile the moment, but the impact. And to this day, there's not a day I can go out anywhere in this metro area where I might not run across somebody who says, I remember you talking about my nephew that was killed, my son that was killed. And, you know, some say, I appreciate that or whatever. Some aren't too happy with some of the stuff that I had to say. But it's recognizing how delicate of a situation it is at the onset is very important.
Thanks so much, TJ. Nikki, did you want to, I know you were kind of moderating the chat. Did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in. Number one, thank you all. I do want to open the mics because typically in a BABJ meeting, we're talking amongst ourselves and we're very casual and open. But since we have a whole bunch of random people in here and we really don't know who you guys are, I would like to have it be open. I can be that person because I don't work for y'all newsrooms. But I want to open the mics because this is still a service to our members. To the members, though, I would like to warn you and remind you that we are a mixed company. I don't know who these people are. And there's probably people like, you know, doing everything from taking screenshots to recording the screen and all that other fun stuff. So ask accordingly if you do have questions. That said, can I start with a question?
Sure. Go for it.
Okay. So last summer, we noticed a lot of well-intentioned advocacy groups really wanting to focus on Black pain and Black Lives Matter. And they wanted to have panels and conversations and the likes then. Okay. I'm just wondering if you've noticed like this type of energy when we would talk about everyday crime issues. It's almost like crime is expected or something here. Like I didn't see these conversations pop up unless it was driven by victim advocacy groups. I hate using victim, but survivors, you know, advocacy groups or the local, just regular leadership that's what they do. So I'm just kind of wondering about like, where's the humanity there? If you cared about, you know, real talk, if you cared about Black Lives Matter and you really want to reach out to, you know, real talk, your white friends want to reach out to their Black friends, say, I care. Where is that care, that empathy that's not driven by Black leadership? Where is that care and that empathy? Are you seeing those stories pop up? Are we missing those stories? I'm trying to make sure that we're not missing news, or is it not happening?
Lisa opened her mic, so I think she wants to weigh in.
But I guess one of the things that I think about when I'm really at my most bitter and cynical is that people know that these stories get awards, they get book deals, they make people money. So a white person can really prosper very well in journalism, kind of trafficking in Black pain. Like I remember when I got hired at City Paper, and everybody was like out somewhere at Club Charles or somewhere, like, and everyone was like, congratulating me on the job. Like, what do you really want to do when you go to City Paper? And I was like, I want to write because like I don't do the kind of, like, I do more featurey long form stuff. I was like, I want to write about some regular Black people stuff. Like there's so much brilliance in being Black, and it has so many variations and shades. And I'm like, there's so much stuff that we go straight for, like those stories, which need to be told, by the way. But like we also at the same time need stories of us just being like regular and awesome. Like one of the stories that I really enjoy, that I really feel most proud of, is a story that I wrote for City Paper on Turner Station, which is the place where Henrietta Lacks is from. I went out there because I was going to write a short thing, because it was around the time that Oprah had done that Henrietta Lacks piece. But what it really made me think about was how much Turner Station reminded me of Parole, which is the community that I grew up in Annapolis, which is just like regular ass, working class Black people, and things that it made me feel like home in those ways. So like that's I guess how I feel about it. Like for many white people, they know that they can write them a little sad story about some tragic Black person, and they will get a Pulitzer and a book deal, and then David Simon will give them a movie deal. But there's lots of other things that they should be doing too.
Lisa, you should put some sunglasses on for that shade.
I mean, it's a shade, though. I mean, my question that I originally put in the comments was, why are people so intrigued by, Baltimore crime? But I kind of feel like it's code for like Black pain. Like they just like to see the bodies topple. Absolutely. And it's like body count in that.
They were fans of The Wire.
Oh my God, yeah. So about The Wire.
No,
welcome to Baltimore.
That was sarcasm. I was being
okay, yeah, about The Wire. But if you saw me and Tremont response, like our visceral response to The Wire, that's what hurts. Real talk for everybody who's joining us today. Glad you're here, but we don't see y'all ever. So the fact that we put out something about crime in Baltimore and y'all just showed up, it kind of made me have a reaction like, why y'all really here? Like, are you worried about reporting on crime? Or are you into some type of weird trauma porn thing where it's like, ooh, let's read another Wire type of thing? That's the response. That's the reaction. And as a journalist in these newsrooms, it's like you're trying to fight for humanity of the subjects, the people that you're talking about. But then when you see the response for it, I'm hoping that I hate to say this, but I hope that they're like more so showing up because they want to see TJ or Lisa say something wild versus you really are into like Black porn, like trauma porn. So fix that up. But you get the idea.
It's funny how much Lisa and I are agreeing today. And so that could be a side note to this BABJ meeting here. But she's was spot on with Black pain has been hijacked by people that don't look like us. Not just in Baltimore, across the country. Mm-hmm. And it has been profited on. And I see these stories, and the bombs basically dropped and exploded in the area, and then they leave. And the Black people that are enduring that pain are left to pick up the pieces. And, while I have respect for the individuals, there were young white guys that were telling the stories of Baltimore crime for many years past. And it's kind of like you don't know it, feel it the same way as some of the individuals in that community. And it's not saying that they can't tell it, because they told some good stories, but I think it's easy for them to get lost in the sauce as well. And we have seen a lot of these so-called advocacy groups. I think they're advocating for their own point of view and not the community's point of view, because what Phillip did, again, I had to go back to that, and hats off to you. Carrollton Ridge is the poorest zip code in the state of Maryland. And it doesn't get the publicity of East and West Baltimore. And I don't know that advocacy groups and advocacy journalists are going down there to understand the depths of the problems that exist there. So that's a major hat tip in understanding what the folks in that community are living with, and talking to that Black woman who's not going to just up and move from there, whether because she doesn't want to or because she can't. So that points are well taken, Lisa. We agree again. So maybe we'll be
let the record show.
Yeah.
Phillip, you wanna weigh in since he just gave you a hat tip?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's kind of like capturing kind of like the bigger scope of what we all been kind of saying is that, I mean, I just think on a general level, you know, and this is just speaking generally in newsrooms, right? Because there has been, you know, amid this, like the racism and police brutality protests that have been happening through 2020, and you know, now we're kind of in like the legality parts of a lot of these cases and whatnot now. There were a lot of conversations happening in newsrooms too as well, between like the LA Times, they did a racial reckoning project. The New York Times, I think literally just about 2 days ago, had a diversity report that they put out. And you know, several other newsrooms have, you know, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette had an issue too as well. So I think what all this really says, when TJ kind of mentioned, you know, like who's covering what and what types of stories, and then how it's done, and then I guess who they talk to and what sources they develop. I mean, I think what all this is really saying is that kind of what people in the community have said all along, which was kind of looked at like as just like some general synopsis that they had. Like, you know, I think one issue that some reporters and some editors have is that they have this kind of weird, somewhat distrust of the community themselves when it comes to them being credibility, for them giving them some types of information or just the type of perspectives that they had. It's like some reporters want to tell the community how they're living as opposed to listening to what the people who live there on a daily basis are telling them. You know, like it like I don't see how you could come into an area that you don't live at, you're not from really, and a person's telling you this, and then you're like, no, it's this, and this, you know, type of situation going on. And then, you know, it's kind of very heavily numbers focused as opposed to, you know, telling a full story. You have kind of like these voices and then the numbers that tell the full picture. I think that's something that just on the general level in newsrooms alone, you know, that has hurt a lot of communities in general. Because I mean, if we were to look at the progress, because it's supposed, you know, journalism is supposed to be somewhat, it should be solution oriented. You should have some solution based stories. And if we're kind of still seeing the same lingering issues for so long, I mean, I think at some point you do have to kind of, some newsrooms do have to kind of like look at themselves and see what needs to change then after that.
I want to jump in with Phillips really quickly, because what he brought up was something that's very important. And speaking as a person that's, I think I've worked in almost every one of our television newsrooms in our market. A lot of what you're seeing when they're like trying to tell the audience what to think, because that's, you know, we get to decide the storyline here, is managers who have been in the market long and feel like that's just the way things are. And when you start mixing in the fact that they are bringing into their decision making their prejudice, they may feel like they have Black friends, they've had Black people on their staff for a long time, but they don't see it from their points of view. So they're just reinforcing the same old crap from 1960. And we run into that. We have to see that. And if you're in a newsroom in a position that does not give you any type of, I don't want to say veto power, but you're just not a manager, then you just kind of have to go along with it a lot. And pushing back can often mean, you know, leaving yourself more susceptible to scrutiny and questionable microaggressions that could lead to unemployment. So there's a lot of, especially in broadcast newsrooms, a lot of your photographers have been there a good 20, 30 years. And they're the ones that are taking the images. They're the ones that are getting the photos, the video of crime scene, folks mourning nearby. They're getting a real slice of life, along with some stuff that might or might not be okay. And then you have those who are in assistant news directors or executive producer positions and news director positions, and they are steering the ship. So as much as we would like to like shake it down and say, hey, you know, I want to talk about the reckoning that needs to happen. A lot of these decisions are being made by people who need to be replaced.
Right. So in the chat earlier, that kind of touches on a couple of questions. One was addressing from Wanda Williams, I think, about if the newsrooms are offering training on racism and discrimination with regard to communities. If anyone wants to weigh in on that, I know that I think some people saw a lot of companies being responsive to BLM 2020. I generally refer to it that way because it had a life of its own, and some people didn't even know about BLM before 2020. So it's like its own entity to me. But there were companies doing things beforehand. And Barry, since you're in a traditional newsroom, can you talk about diversity training in your shop a little bit?
Yeah, we have seminars and things that we have to take care, that we have to do annually, dealing with diversity. And the other thing is, since and recently they've added more. They've added not only more training, and I think many of the other stations have too. I know our corporation is doing more in terms of trying to deal with diversity training, dealing with trying to get people to come together and understand that there are differences, and that we all may not think alike, but we do have to respect each other, and we need to work together. And also looking at the communities that you're based in. So, I mean, we're doing some things now that are dealing with just the Baltimore region, and also we're doing stuff on a corporate level for all of our television stations. One of the things that that Phillip talked about and I was thinking about was the newspapers and others that are looking back at how they have covered things in the past and how they are now reckoning with their own past. And it's amazing to see where they're now realizing how there were so many things that they did or that we did as journalists wrong. It's amazing to see that they're looking at that now. And the question is, and I've had this question for a long time, why did it take till now? Because these are the same things, and many of these same issues are things that people have been bringing up in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, all the way up to now. Okay, so I mean, and it seems my concern is, and my worry is, that we get started and we start going down this path, and then all of a sudden it's like cyclical. Oh, okay, well, we've done enough of this now, let's move back, and then we go right back into the same old patterns. And that bothers me, because it's like either we're going to continue on, or if we're not going to, then you've got us to keep fighting to do what we can, and we'll try to train some others to fight too. But the thing is, if it's only going to be cyclical, where we do some for a while and then we back away from it, then we're not accomplishing anything. And that is my biggest concern about the way that all this is going on right now.
Yeah, consistency is key for sure. At least I see you nodding your head. Do you want to weigh in?
I mean, I think Barry already hit it on the head. Like, it's like, for white people, they can pick it up and put it down. For us, it's every day. And I talked a little bit about how many we have lost and how it's so important to have people, like, journalism is the opposite of modeling. You only get better as you get older. But like, if you get pushed out because you lose your job, or you get pushed out because you were the person in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s tapping people like, hey, this is racist, and eventually you just get fired or you just get burned out. Those are just like so many voices that we are now missing and will not get back, because they're like Nikki said in the chat, like there's certain managers that she's not going to work with, because why put your mental health at stake to do this? So it's like, it's very frustrating. And it goes back to what I was saying in answer to the first question. It's like, move out of the way and let people of color take over and do this stuff, so that they don't have to be doing this extra work on top of like doing their job, making y'all look good because you're like, hey, look at this Black and brown person, and also doing the work of pointing out when you're, behind the scenes doing racist stuff. Let us just do the job then.
Yeah. Maria, I think you have your hand raised. Did you want to ask a question? Maria Roberts.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. My question is to the entire panel. I wanted to ask about like how social media accounts have affected your reporting. Specifically, you know, young folks who are out in the streets there, and sometimes, you know, you got a camera, you think you're the street reporter, and you're recording some of these crimes that take place, and then you put it out there for mass consumption. Obviously, I'm not going to name those types of sites, but how does that help or hinder your reporting when you have to deal with that, and does it prevent you from reporting effectively?
Barry, you look like you're muted, Barry.
Barry, you're still muted.
Unmute. There, I got it.
There you go. Okay.
Everything was popping up at the same time, so I couldn't get to the mute button. Sorry about that. I kept trying. One of the things that I know with some of the stuff that I've seen on social media, sometimes it's made me look and go, maybe I need to look into this other stuff or this other aspect that they may be talking about. And it sometimes gives me much more information that I may not have had, or it may give me a little bit of information dealing with the community that I may not have realized. Other times, though, it is something that can be sometimes a hindrance too, because it's like, okay, they're saying this, but there's no way in the world that I'm going to be able to report this information. There's also and how do I know that it's accurate? How do I know where it's coming from? How do I figure this all out? And so I have to basically, a lot of it comes down to my own gut. If my gut says, hey, there's more, looking at this stuff, and there's more that you really need to go and deal with and find, then a lot of times then I have to trust my gut on that. But there are times when people will put things up on social media and it is just dead wrong. And people are asking me about, oh, well, they said this. And I'm like, well, they may say that, but if I put that up, first I'm going to get sued or I'm going to get fired, or both. So I can't go with just because they put it up on social media. It doesn't matter to me that at that point that they put it up. Now, if it's asking a question that we need to really get to the bottom of or get an answer to, that's very different. But if somebody just puts something up on social media just to put it up on social media and they give their own perspective, that doesn't mean it's accurate. We had a situation where I had never, and I think I called TJ about this too, because, oh no, he told me about it. That's what happened. There was some video that was up about a murder that happened downtown. It had just happened and people were already putting it up on social media. And not only did they put it up, but in the video, you could see that it's the crime scene. You see the police scrambling to try to secure the scene. And you see all these people with their phones in the way and not moving. And nobody's helping the victim who has been stabbed, seriously stabbed. So I'm looking at the video and it turns out to be my neighbor from across the street. And I'm like, I can't believe this. And so, eventually, after dealing with the whole situation, I mean, I finally talked with the gentleman's mother. He ends up dying. But it was just amazing to see this video and nobody's doing anything except shooting video. And that, I don't think that's where we're supposed to be. I don't think as journalists or as people. We're supposed to help. Somebody call 911, somebody do something. But they were just standing there shooting video. And you could see other people shooting the video because they were all shooting, just standing around, and you get shots of other people in the showing what they're doing. I have to be very careful with social media stuff. I have to make sure that first, I have to make sure that the information is accurate. And I try real hard not to report anything. I try real hard to not just use that as a source or anything like that. If I see something and I need to ask about it, I'll ask about it. But I can't put that on just because. And well, first of all, we have to get permission to put anything on anyway, dealing with somebody's social media.
Mm-hmm.
But second, I'm not sure if there's like somebody putting out a perspective or something like that. It's very difficult for me to just say, oh yeah, I can just go ahead and use that. I just can't.
Yeah. And you got to make sure you're getting permission from the person who owns the rights to the video.
Right. I've got to make sure I have that, because the interesting thing is they can sue me too.
Yeah.
So, because it's theirs. It's their information.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of deep fakes. There's people altering video. There's a whole list of verifying situations that, fall into pulling video off of social media, especially when it shows a crime taking place. So I think everybody on here should know that, but just had to throw that in there that you have to be very careful about. We saw this on Twitter or on Instagram. If it's an altered video, now the credibility of both you and your news organization is at question.
Did anyone else want to chime in? Because I think Nisha had a question as well.
Yeah, I had two.
Okay.
One is how does news media gain the trust of the community that they are covering?
Say one more time.
How does news media gain the trust of the community they are covering?
Okay, thanks. Phillip, you want to jump in on that one? I mean, I think that kind of was something that you addressed a little bit earlier when you were talking about, not just coming in when it's crime, but I didn't know if you had anything else to add.
Yeah. Well, of course, consistency is one way. But, I guess it just all leads back to presence. But part of that also is then when you leave to do the story, I think when the story is done, it's always good to circle back within maybe a few weeks to a month. I think that's one way that you build trust as a reporter or people who just work in media in general, whatever your position is. I think keeping that consistent contact, because if we're speaking in the context of crime, then there's a situation where, court cases end up coming months down the line or a year down the line or something like that. And I think you're in your best position as a reporter when you're genuine about it. And then when you keep that consistent contact with that family or, whoever your source is in that situation, because that's people are going to remember the stories that they gave you, what you talked to them about, and, how you wrote it. There's a lot of times where people have reached out to me, with certain things I can't necessarily do. Like they'll ask me to, can I look at the story before you turn it into your editor, or, or something like that, especially if it's like something in the sense of like a profile and I'm writing about somebody's child, right, or, something like that. So I think, you just have to be smart about how consistent you are with reaching out to these people and really kind of ask yourself, okay, why am I doing this story in the first place? And, and then why is it of importance to me and of importance to this community, and then of importance into this certain family or person that it's impacting.
Thanks. We have a couple more that I want to get to. Wanda Williams.
Hi, thank you so much. I posed the question in the chat about training because I'm a former broadcast news reporter. I reported and anchored and worked in newsrooms primarily in the Southeast, starting off in my home state and hometown in Mississippi. And at the time, there was no training offered to newsroom staff with regards to racial and discriminatory behavior. And while I went on to secure jobs, I think because they were looking for that Black reporter or Black anchor, I always felt like I was expected to sort of train and enlighten my fellow staff about issues as it pertained to the African-American community. And it was exhausting. And I, began to resent having to do that. But I did it willingly, didn't have a problem with it. But now, years later, now that diversity training is being offered, I was just curious. I wondered if newsrooms had sort of opened and began to offer that type of training to reporters, because I found that they would, obtain their degrees in journalism, come into newsrooms with many of the same types of stereotypical behavior and ideas about not just African American communities, but other communities that they simply were not familiar with. So that is something that I think is really pivotal in trying to really sort of attack this patriarchal kind of white gaze that exists when it comes to sort of framing Black identities. And to pick up on what Nikki said about this intrigue with the city of Baltimore and crime here, I didn't work in broadcast news here in this market, but I know when being an outsider coming into this community, I'm reminded of just the history of Baltimore with regards to the 19th century history, having one of the largest free Black populations in the country, and being pioneering in so many areas, but I don't see that reflected in the media coverage of the city with regards to the history of the city of Baltimore. And I think this overemphasis and this sort of fetish with crime, you see it in other in other parts of the country as well, but in Baltimore, it seems like it's on steroids. And so I just wanted to offer that comment, and thanks so much for this wonderful panel.
Yeah, glad you're here, Wanda. When we have another raised hand, Hassan.
Yes, hi, thanks for taking my question here in advance. I'm actually not originally from Baltimore myself. I came here from Los Angeles about, let's call it 15 years ago at this stage. And some of what I see here reflects to me on what I saw in Los Angeles, particularly during the mid 90s and early 90s, wherein crime was in one segment of the city and outside reporting on that was reflected in a way that I'll say was disconnected, so to speak. And so I see some of that particularly here in Maryland, where I'll turn on the 11 o'clock news, whether it be WJZ, WBAL, Fox 45, WBFF, whichever network I'll tune into, or even if I pick up the paper, so I'll read previously City Paper, Baltimore Sun. And commonly what I'll see is a reporting that reflects something along the lines of, say, and I think it was alluded to earlier in this call, someone was killed previously in the night earlier or in the early hours of or in the afternoon, etc. And some of it still, to me, and I have seen improvements in this lately, but unfortunately still retains that disconnected nature, wherein it's just a point on point, just X number of people were killed. Here's the total number of people murdered in Baltimore. Here's how many people were murdered in Baltimore last year. And here's we're on track to meet that this year. Are we going to hit 300 again? Are we going to top last year's count? Are we going to be below last year's count? It's like every number is devoid of the fact that there was a life behind that person who was killed. It's just a race to get to a certain number. And I'll personally admit that on a level, I don't necessarily agree with everything that everybody here says, nor do I disagree with what everyone here has said in the past, prior outside of this conversation. But I've listened to persons like TJ Smith over the years who has previously said, like, why do we focus on so many numbers? Every single person is a number. And I feel like that's lost in reporting. So a couple of years ago, WBAL aired a feature, I believe it was on a Sunday, midday. I don't even think it had any fanfare to it, where they did a particular focus on young people who had been killed in Baltimore. And it was surrounding them, the pain that their parents went through, the loss that their friends experienced, even going to show some of them, and I don't even want to imagine the level of trauma that this may have put people through, but going so far as to show people while they were in the midst of having their funerals for kids as young as 2, 3, 6, 9 years old who had been killed here in Baltimore. And so many times we see this reporting and it's just reported as just a number, say for when the young girl was shot in the back of the car on 40 a couple of years back. It's outside of those typical incidents, atypical incidents, excuse me. Everyone is just reported as a number. And I would just put to the panel here to ask, how can we go about humanizing, or how can you all as journalists go about humanizing the people whom are victims here in Baltimore, making sure that they're not just treated as a number when it comes to not just the statistics that are reported every year, but each individual report of a murder. Because as was stated earlier in this call, you know, that's somebody's son, daughter, boyfriend, husband, etc. Somebody has lost someone that they love. And that's just where I'll leave it at.
Thanks, Hassan. Lisa, you want to respond? We're getting close to.
I mean, I think that's why it's good that there are so many different ways to, you know, kind of outlets for storytelling. There's people that can do these longer feature stories. There's people that do the initial, you know, when the crime first happens. I think these conversations are important. And I think that, like, yeah, we just have to keep adding that context and keep pushing. Really, like, the other thing that I really think I try to use my Twitter account for, because there's, you know, there's a certain amount of power that we have in newsrooms. It's like helping other people that are not journalists understand that they, you know, you don't have to sit there and be fed these stories. So like you can, you know, call up folks like, you know, maybe not call Latoya, but, you know, you can email
my email in the chat.
You can email these organizations, you can email these various news outlets and say, I'm not supporting you because you're doing these things. You can know, I try to let people know, like, this is what we were taught when I was sitting in Towson in journalism class, and this is what the story is, and they're not adding up for me. So like, you know, be active participants in this too. And let people know, because especially now when nobody has any money, they want to hear from everybody because that affects their bottom line. So you know, there's ways inside and outside of the system, I think, that we can work to make sure that stories are covered better.
Thanks, Lisa. So yeah, I'm gonna open it up to the panel. Like we have a couple more minutes. So do you just want to make any comments in general about like the discussion we've had today? Any closing thoughts? We'd love to hear from you.
I'll go ahead and close and also answer the last question.
Okay.
If you think politics, a lot of professional politicians find their way in this world, and people remember them because they remember something about them. And you'll say, oh, he remembered my name, or whatever the case might be. He says he knew I had 3 children. If we look at the victims of violence the same way, and when we're conveying that message to the public, that we care, that there's some level of empathy in the dead body that's on the ground, that there's a surviving mom, or, I mean, I used to say it all the time, and I know I did my job a little differently, but I used to say it all the time, that there's a family preparing for a funeral. And can you imagine the steps in that process? Just so people can understand it's not normal. This is not a normal occurrence that's happening in someone's life right now. And, you know, in a few days from now, we're not going to be talking about them. We're going to move on. But there, and I have illustrated this way with the amount of violence we have in Baltimore. Literally every single day in Baltimore, someone is either being notified of their loved one's death or planning for the funeral of their loved one murder. Somebody's being notified of a murder or planning for a funeral for that person that's been murdered every single day. That's outrageous when you really think about it. So we can't normalize it. And I think the more we humanize it, the better off we as a community will be. And with that, I just will close by saying thank you all for having me. Very interesting intersections of conversation here that are extraordinarily important. It's like, you know, we have a lot to do to make sure everything's done in a more fair and just way in order to connect with the people who are going through a lot of that trauma and emotion, because we're dealing with finality here. We're talking about murder and crime and grime. In Baltimore, I saw a couple of the questions in the chat, why do we have to talk about it so much in Baltimore? Unfortunately, we're one of the most violent places in the country. So it's a reality of what is happening here. And if we don't talk about it, then we could be ignoring some of those families that are going through this on a daily basis and marginalizing people who could be getting involved with stopping some of this. So thank you all. I hope everybody's family is safe, and go out and get the vaccine when its opportunity presents itself.
Thank you so much, TJ. Phillip, you want to give any closing comments?
Yes, just probably like a quick answer to the question. I think and then a closing comment. I think that also another part with the victims aspect is that, you know, like newsrooms are political too as well, you know, and what people want to cover and how they want to cover it. So when you have a city like Baltimore, like has a 300 plus trend for years, you know, there's a notion and perspective that's developed with people who might have been there for however long, or, you know, whatever the case may be, with the person who was killed in a certain type of incident. You know, like, you know, there's been cases where families have reached out to me and told me, you know, I want to make sure that this specific story isn't tying him to like this stereotype of Baltimore, to where everybody who was killed kind of like put themselves in that position. You know, like that's, we shouldn't, like, for one thing, like that perspective alone shouldn't even kind of exist, right? And then also, you know, like when you're trying to, I think that, well, I think a lot of this kind of develops when that you don't really have, when you never really had that consistency of covering victims, homicide victims or whatnot, and you just kind of leave it as is, as like the small police brief that comes into you on a daily basis. I think that's how things kind of exasperate and get to a lot of bigger issues that we're seeing and discussing now. And I think you just really have to start, if you're just a journalist and a reporter in the newsroom, I think you just have to really start with recognizing that and bringing it forth to your editor. And you're gonna face a lot of pushback, but you're gonna have to fight for it going forward, because you should, you know, like, again, like, you should understand that humanizing victims is important, and that, you know, whether in many type of instances, you know, there's never necessarily been like a perfect clean cut victim. And even if there is or not, it doesn't mean like somebody's life is worth more than the other. And then just to like close, I would say, well, thank you for having me be a part of the discussion. I really appreciate it. And also appreciated everybody's comments too as well. It was a real good discussion I think we could have.
Thank you so much, Phillip. Barry, you want to close us out?
Yeah, I'm going to try to be brief. Just two things. One, to answer Hassan's question. And one of the things that I remember that I saw that was one of the most spectacular things I've seen that the Baltimore Sun did, and I'm just throwing that out there, was they looked at the homicides in the whole year, and they had pictures of the people. And it was spectacular because it gave you a sense of who these people were. The piece that we did, we actually ran it twice, and Hassan talked about it in the afternoon. We had done it earlier on a primetime special at 7 o'clock so that people could see it as well. And but it was just dealing with the kids. But the other thing is, for both of those pieces, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of resources to try to put all of that together for just covering for a whole year and looking at that, and then trying to deal with these families and trying to first getting the trust of all the other families that are willing to do all of that. It takes a lot. And that's why you probably don't see a lot of it all the time. And yes, Baltimore, we talk about 300 cases or how many, but we try to get the numbers from other communities just to let people know that many others don't give out what their total numbers are sometimes. So it's much more difficult to get that information. So Baltimore at least is open enough to say, look, we know that we got this problem and we're dealing with it, and this is what's happening. But I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thanks for the very good questions, the great questions, and thanks for letting me be a part of this. Take care.
All right. Thank you guys so much. You guys been awesome. So glad that we were able to put this together. Thank you, Nikki, for getting our guests to join us today. And thank you for all the visitors. You know, we do this, like she said once a month. And we're actually having a membership drive right now, right, David?
Wait, are we going to let Lisa close out?
Oh, I thought
she's still here.
No, I thought that I'm sorry. I thought
my last question.
Yeah, I thought that was her last.
Yes.
Yeah.
My bad.
My bad too.
You know what? It's fine. Yeah, because we started with her. So
equal opportunities here.
Yeah, absolutely. You know. So yeah, I think we went through the panel for closing thoughts and comments, and there was some, some contact information shared in the chat for people who want to reach out. And like I said, we can follow each other on social media platforms as well. So thanks so much.
And wrap them up.
You guys have a great and safe weekend.
Thank you, everybody, for
Thanks,
coming.
guys.
Check out our website. Bye, y'all.
Bye.